let me start by just welcoming everyone to today's webinar, our Giant Conversations, which Space for Giants is hosting with the Arts Club. 2 weeks ago, we gave a talk, a webinar with some fantastic panelists, really looking at the link between the illegal wildlife trade and the emergence of deadly disease. A hugely compelling case for why we should be incredibly worried, in actual fact, and why this is such an important subject. And today, we're going to focus on the next stage in this series, which is really how do we prevent the supply of wildlife parts from natural habitat to consumer markets. And today, for today's webinar, we've got some fantastic speakers. To start with, Lord William Hague, who needs no introduction, the former Foreign Secretary for Her Majesty's government and the former leader of the British Conservative Party, and he's the current chair of the United for Wildlife Task Force, which is tackling the trafficking of illegal wildlife products as part of a collaboration of 7 big conservation organizations together with the Royal Foundation. Welcome, William. Our second panelist today is John Scanlon. John is the former Secretary General of CITES, with decades of conservation leadership across various roles in government, the private sector, and of course the United Nations. And since June of this year, among other roles, he has served as the chair of the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime. We're very lucky to have you here, John. And last but not least, Shamini Jayanathan, welcome. Shamini is an internationally renowned Crown prosecutor. She's been focused on wildlife law and justice. She's been pioneering new criminal justice solutions to combat the illegal wildlife trafficking across major wildlife range states on the African continent, and has bags of experience. So really looking forward to today's webinar. Welcome our panelists, and ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for taking the time to join us this evening. It's a great honor to have you join us for this exciting panel. So let's start with you, William, if that's okay. I really want to understand, there's been a huge amount of work, a huge amount of muscle that's been invested in combating the illegal wildlife trade. It's not least by the admirable coalition that you've put together with His Royal Highness Prince William, the Duke of Cambridge. But why is it then, with all this work and muscle, that wild animals of the kinds that might cause pandemics are still being caught in the wild and shipped off to illegal markets?
Well, thank you. This is a very good question, of course, and I suppose, a couple of reasons. The first one is that even with the involvement of many different companies, and in our task force we have 130 transportation companies, we've now got 40 global banks and payment companies working together, we're only scratching the surface, really, in the scale of what we can do. We have trained about 70,000 employees of companies in awareness of the illegal wildlife trade, and we have supported over 100 law enforcement investigations so far. But even all of that effort, with all of that effort, we've still only interdicted between 100 and 200 suspected shipments. We have had traffickers arrested as a result of our work, but it's a small proportion of the traffickers who will be at work. So this is such a vast industry. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry that is very well used to evading law enforcement. So this is one aspect of it. It's a massive task, and not all governments treat it as a high priority. I think this is an important point for our discussion, that most crime agencies don't necessarily see this as the top of the... Even in the UK, our own National Crime Agency doesn't have high priority, although I would argue that actually there's a lot of convergence between those who traffic in illegal wildlife products and those who also traffic in drugs and people and many other of the terrible trades of the world. The other big problem, of course, is that as long as there is demand for illegal products, somebody will be paid enough to come up with a supply. You know, this is the case in all of those, with drugs, people, arms, whatever else. And there is still demand. One of the things that the Duke of Cambridge did, which very few of us could do, was address 300 million people on television in China about, you know, what the wildlife trade really means. That you have to kill an elephant to get the ivory. It's not like a tooth that falls out. And so public opinion, making sure, particularly on the back of this crisis, that public opinion, and there's a lot of evidence of that in China and other countries, that there's a fresh revulsion against this trade. That is a crucial ingredient. Whatever we do in ships and aircraft and ports, the ultimate answer is for it to be utterly unacceptable in public opinion all over the world to trade wild animals for consumption. And indeed, that it should be unacceptable. I won't go, I could talk for great length, of course, but I know that's just your opening question, so I'll stop there.
No, very interesting, William. Thank you very much. And I think, you know, the fact that it is just this huge illicit trade, you know, the fourth largest in the world after arms, drugs, and people, just gives you an idea, just the muscle that's involved with the criminals behind the scenes. So, yeah, I mean, it's obviously a big challenge. And John, you know, for many years and until very recently, you were running the single most important convention on the trade in endangered species, known by its acronym CITES, the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species. And, you know, I just wonder, has CITES let us down here in this particular case?
Well, thanks very much, Max. Has CITES let us down here? I'd say no. What I would say is that this pandemic has shined a very bright light on the limitations of CITES. And that is the limitations of CITES as it relates to how it regulates legal trade and how it goes about combating illegal trade. And you can illustrate that by looking at the most likely source of the pandemic. I know it's not agreed yet, but the most likely source appears to be from a horseshoe bat. It is not listed under CITES. Many bat species are not listed under CITES. And it transmitted to an intermediate host, a pangolin, which is regulated under CITES. It's on what's called Appendix 1, commercial trade is banned, and yet it's the most heavily trafficked mammal on the planet. So there you've got a bit of a contrast. One's not regulated, one is, and yet they could both be the source of this pandemic. Now, if you look at the way in which CITES regulates trade, it only looks at it in relation to trade and biological criteria. So if a species is going to be regulated, there are trade and biological criteria that are taken into account, and if they meet them, then they're listed. There's nothing there about public health criteria, or animal health criteria for that matter. So it could pose a huge risk for public health, but it's not taken into account in listing the species. When it comes to regulating that trade and the authorities signing off to allow a trade or not, they only look at whether or not that trade is going to lead to threaten the survival of that species. They don't look to see whether or not that trade could threaten public health at its destination, or whether or not there could be a risk to animal health. So it's not looking at public or animal health criteria in its decision-making. That's a huge limitation. We have to change the way in which we regulate wildlife trade. On the other side, in terms of illegal trade, we see a weakness there too. We have no international agreement on wildlife crime. In the absence of any agreement, we turn to CITES with some level of success. But it was never designed to deal with illegal trade, nor wildlife crime, which is a much wider concept. The convention was created to deal with regulating trade. And where that trade contravened the convention, you had to penalise it, not criminalise it. It only deals with cross-border movement. So it doesn't deal with poaching, it deals with the cross-border movement of specimen. It only deals with 36,000 of the 8 million species on the planet. And as I said, it doesn't deal with most bats. It certainly doesn't deal with the horseshoe bat, it's not listed. And nor is this a natural forum for enforcement authorities, be it customs or police or judges or prosecutors. It's not a forum for them. We got them to some meetings, but it's not a natural forum for them. So I think it didn't let us down, but we've seen the limitations of the convention as it's currently structured for dealing with regulating trade, dealing with illegal trade. And we as a community will let down the next generation if we don't correct these errors going forward.
Really, really interesting, John. Yeah, and I think I mean that's very, very helpful. So it seems like we might need something else. This leads me to a question, Shamini. You're a prosecutor, and you've got this experience at the coalface of trying to create these convictions and high penalties for those involved. What are the current challenges facing prosecutors in the countries that hold wild animals? That humanity that we all really don't want going to the market, and what has worked to help meet those challenges?
Well, Max, I've worked with prosecutors and judges all across Africa, from Mogadishu to Mozambique, and the problems encountered in the day-to-day working life of prosecutors are many. In part, this may be because there simply aren't enough of them. In part, this is because access to laws is not always there. If you're in a remote courtroom in Angola, there won't be a law library that's kept up to date for you to access. And if the internet connection isn't reliable, you're not going to be able to look up an obscure piece of law like a Wildlife Act. If you are able to look it up, you're probably going to be reading a law that's over 100 pages long on the small screen of your smartphone. A lot of it has to do with the fact that prosecutors' case management is still paper-based. One file is physically moving from a police station to a courtroom and then back to the police station again until the next hearing. But perhaps the biggest challenge is the way in which prosecutors are asked to make their decision to prosecute or not. It's very frequently at the very last minute, with a police officer almost tapping them on the shoulder whilst they're at the doors of court. I have seen prosecutors facing 24 trials listed in one courtroom in one day. And at the same time, there was a horde of investigators waiting, queuing up outside for her to make a charging decision on other fresh cases. So the interventions that I've seen work have been the ones that take a more holistic approach. And at the outset, I would say that many of my views are based on first-hand experience that came about as a result of measures implemented by the British government, whilst you, William, were Foreign Secretary. And I know you've engaged directly with it because you opened the embassy in Somalia, whilst I was the counter-terrorism criminal justice advisor for Somalia and Kenya at the time. Now, at that time, the British government, under the banner of counter-terrorism, supported the prosecution services in Kenya and Somalia to codify the way in which all criminal cases were charged, not just terrorism. And that is because we recognize that in order to lay a foundation for the prosecution of terrorism, we needed to lay a foundation for the prosecution of all crime. And sure enough, within 18 months, a prosecutor in Kenya told me that at the point at which he'd charged suspects in a terrorism case, he was actually in a position to go to trial the very next day. That code gave him the steer that he needed and improved, most importantly, the quality of the guidance that he was able to give investigators. And it meant that that case was prepared by the time the suspects were actually arrested. Now, in conservation, very few NGOs have actually taken this approach. And Max, as you know, Space for Giants is one of them, using the banner of elephants to do exactly the same thing in Botswana and Uganda. Another holistic intervention, also involving the British government, was when we supported the Kenyan judiciary in an initiative to reduce the delay in the courts. Now, in pilot courts, this reduced trial times from 32 months to less than a year, and delay and multiple adjournments are a huge challenge for prosecutors, as well, it has to be said, for the defence who represent defendants. That pilot is now being rolled out nationally with the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime. Now, it's taken a long time to get that off the ground. There is much to be done, but the point is this. By 2018, a survey of court outcomes in North Kenya showed the average number of adjournments for wildlife cases had fallen from about 11 as a national average to 5. So that sort of holistic approach, which actually institutionalized within the prosecution services of both countries, has stood the test of time. It's still being implemented there. It's still being implemented in Botswana. I was speaking to a prosecutor there only on Friday. Those sorts of interventions are the one that actually enable institutional memory to be created. And they enhance the criminal justice response to all crimes. And I think that's vital because countries which are rich in the sort of biodiversity that we want to protect, by and large, have weak rule of law in relation to all types of criminality. And I think that is why, as William said, there is a challenge in getting certain divisions, certain investigative services to prioritize wildlife crime over others.
Yeah, interesting, Shamini. Well, I mean, that's a fascinating insight to what we're dealing with at the coalface in terms of capacity, to actually tackle this challenge. I just, building on John's point, William, around CITES not necessarily letting us down, but the limitations that are there. I was very interested to see in a recent article you supporting calls for a new international convention that would treat activities that increase the risk of zoonotic disease outbreaks in the same way that we might treat other global security issues such as weapons of mass destruction. That's fascinating. Can you explain more about what this convention is and how it might work?
Well, I suppose it's quite an ambitious idea. Most diplomats would say, oh, courageous minister having this idea. But what's happening to the world now is the most devastating thing for decades. And so we ought to be able to come up with an appropriate response to that and to prevent it happening again. And prevention is key. We are all told in our own healthcare that prevention is better than cure. Well, how about the world applying that to this catastrophe and to prevent future pandemics that jump out of into humans from wildlife, rather than having to manage them and more of them over years to come? So there's a really strong case. And if I was still in government, in the UK government, I would now be saying to China, well, look, you are hosting the upcoming conference on biodiversity, albeit postponed. We're going to be hosting the COP on climate change, all in the G20 together. So together we could really propose something bold here. And it ought to be a new convention, which we ask for endorsement of the United Nations, for the nations of the world to sign up to it. Forbidding the trading of wild animals for consumption, with a UN body to monitor, to research, to investigate. That would be the key ingredient, a new international body to monitor breaches of the commitments that nations make. There are plenty of those bodies. We have them for all sorts of reasons, to investigate breaches of agreements on chemical weapons or on the use of atomic facilities. And so given that what we're experiencing now is such a catastrophe for the world, this subject ought to have such a body. So I think it is there. I think it actually, if I was the Chinese government, I would be putting it forward from China. And then if I was the American government, I'd think, why don't I propose it before the Chinese do? There ought to be some real international peer pressure to get this going. And I think the UK is in a good position to start that ball rolling.
Well, that's fascinating. And I think, it's presumably, I think that's precisely what's needed. And it's great that you made that call. John, over and above this new convention that William's championing, what can be done to really put some more muscle behind the existing conventions to tackle wildlife crime and prevent the next pandemic?
Thanks, Max. And I really like that idea of William's about the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Climate Change Convention and the convergence there. That's so critical to bring these two agendas together. Leaving that aside, I think now is the time to stimulate some thinking about where we have gaps in the international system and how we might fill those gaps. In your earlier question, Max, you asked me about, did CITES let us down? I said no, but there are limitations. And they're the limitations in terms of our wildlife trade laws do not build public or animal health into decision making. That's a fundamental flaw, and that exposes us to the risk of future pandemics. And in addition to that, we don't have any global agreement on combating wildlife crime. We're relying heavily upon CITES as the instrument that we keep referring back to. I'd suggest there's two things we should look at. Firstly, we need to take a One Health approach to wildlife trade. And we need to bring together issues of, the biological criteria, issues to do with public health and animal health, and deal with them at one and the same time. You should not be authorizing a trade under CITES, for example, of a bat because it's not threatening the survival of the species of the wild, when where it's going to, it could be consumed and lead to the next pandemic. So we need to bring these issues together through a One Health approach. I believe we can do that in several ways. We can amend CITES, we can have a new protocol under the Convention on Biological Diversity, we can have a new agreement under the WHO. I think the most effective and efficient way forward is to amend CITES, oblige CITES to add to its criteria public and animal health in deciding whether to list a species under the convention, create a new committee, there's 2 science committees, a new committee on public and animal health, and oblige the management authority never to authorise a trade under CITES unless they have first determined the public and animal health risk associated with that trade, not just the risk associated with the survival of that species in the wild. So I think we really need to embed public and animal health into the wildlife trade system. On the illegal trade side, as I said before, we've relied heavily on CITES, and I think we've done quite well. But I do believe that we need to now really, bite the bullet here and finally determine as an international community, we want to treat wildlife crime as a serious crime. We want this crime embedded into the international criminal justice framework to give a clear and unequivocal political message through this international agreement to say, we're going to now expect the criminal justice system to give this priority. And I believe what we could do is create a 4th protocol under the UN Convention Against Transnational Organised Crime. There are 3 protocols at the moment on human trafficking, on trafficking in migrants, and illicit manufacture and trafficking of firearms. I believe we could have a 4th protocol on wildlife crime. And I say wildlife crime because I don't think we should just be looking at the 36,000 species that are listed under CITES. There are a huge range of species that are in illegal trade. And a recent World Bank report says if you look at CITES, it's worth about up to 20 billion. If you look at all wildlife, animal, plant, marine, terrestrial that's in illegal trade, it's about 200 billion. Why do we only pay attention to a species when it's threatened with extinction? We ought to look at all wildlife. No one should be allowed to steal any wildlife from a country and bring it to another country unless they can prove legal origin. And this is very much the Lacey Act approach in the US. You cannot import wildlife from another country into the US, whether it's CITES listed or not, unless you can prove legal origin. And if you cannot, you're going to be subject to criminal sanctions. So I think we have to have a complete rethink about wildlife crime, embedded into the international criminal justice system. That's its natural home. Send a very strong message. Use the tools available to us under the UN Convention Against Transnational Organised Crime, and widen the scope. Let's look at all wildlife crime, whether CITES listed or not, because you should not be allowed to get away with stealing wildlife just because it's not currently endangered.
Yeah, John, I mean, there's some really good ideas there, and that's, I think, very robust. Makes a lot of sense to be focusing on other conventions, giving them muscle. I like that a lot. And I mean, Shamini, if you go down to the ground, in your experience of working with prosecutors and judges across the world, how do you see these international conventions that William and John have talked about, giving them more muscle, creating a new one in William's case? How do you see that have an impact on the ground, at the ground level?
I think we have to tread quite carefully about thinking that another protocol may actually be an answer to the very serious issues that both William and John have raised. After all, we could stop and ask ourselves, have the protocols on arms, drugs, and human trafficking put a stop to those crimes? International conventions, such as the one on organised crime and those like it, set out very clear guidance on how countries can approach the issues of exchanging evidence, extraditing accused persons, what key offences to legislate upon, what ancillary powers are useful. And as a symbol of unity, they are potentially quite powerful. The London Declaration turned out a renewed commitment to tackle wildlife crime as organised crime, and that echoed the resolution passed by the East African Legislative Assembly in 2013 to use the full range of laws in tackling wildlife crime as organised crime. And yet we have seen within months of this global pandemic, it seems that poaching is on the rise. 6 elephants slaughtered in Ethiopia last week. Botswana is relocating its rhinos because she can't protect them. And just yesterday, the largest haul ever of fish bladders was seized in the Far East. And this is happening because criminals know, as they have always known, that there's little to fear from the criminal justice systems in which they're sourcing and transiting these products. So if we look at the impact of international agreements, we must start from understanding that for most countries, until those protocols and conventions are actually put on a domestic legislative footing, the existing laws of that country will trump those declarations. Every single country will need to work, that I work in, already has wildlife laws. It has mutual legal assistance. It has extradition laws. It has money laundering laws. Very many of them have organized crime laws. And most prosecutors that I work with understand that they can use the full range of laws available. I don't think legislation and conventions are the problem. The problem is one of implementation. Secondly, we also have to accept the independence of the judiciary from the executive is fiercely guarded. No president can tell his chief justice or head of a prosecution agency what to do. I mean, they can try, but we see that time and again it's met with great resistance. So in my view, any international convention or protocol must be, in order to be effective, it's got to be coupled with a demand that these jurisdictions in which these crimes are occurring finally commit once and for all to properly resource their investigation, prosecution, and judicial authorities so that they can actually create a hostile environment for all crimes and not just wildlife crimes. I'm afraid I think it's unrealistic to ask a director of public prosecutions to prioritize pangolins and parrots over gender-based violence and the pilfering of public funds, which affect the public, whom he or she serves on a day-to-day basis. So renewed international commitment can help if it can be coupled with a concerted effort to demand that these countries properly invest in their criminal justice systems as a whole. The investigative institutions need to be properly resourced with well-trained investigators who can actually get petrol into their tanks so that they can visit a crime scene, so that government funds are allocated to the prosecution services to enable those prosecution services to hire enough people of the right caliber to embrace technology and establish mechanisms for early collaboration with police officers. We need to allocate sufficient resources to the judiciary from treasuries so that they too can embrace technology, don't have to write in courtrooms that reach 45 degrees in the summer, and where they don't have to write their judgments whilst ignoring the stench of leopard skins that are being stored in an office cupboard because the exhibit room is completely full. If we can recognise those needs at an international level and turn these good intentions towards a more practical and holistic approach, rather than thinking that we can somehow silo off wildlife crime in isolation, then I have no doubt that we can succeed.
I mean, that's fascinating. And I think, it really illuminates that this has got to be a holistic approach. And I think, there's clearly a once in a generation opportunity to combine the high level international injection of muscle into a new convention, existing conventions, but that's only worthwhile if we can couple that with investment on the ground in the jurisdictions in which wildlife occurs and is traded. So, I mean, I think, this is absolutely what needs to happen, is that coupled holistic approach. I think, on that, in terms of jurisdictions, the big question, I think, for many people is, I can see how the British government, with the electorate so concerned about wildlife, I can imagine the American government, as John mentioned, already putting in quite binding, a very difficult environment for wildlife crime to foster. But what about Asian African governments? William, what about China? Can we expect China to really commit to ensuring we never get into this kind of mess again?
Well, the one thing about China, I have lots of differences with China, as you can imagine, but one aspect of China that's advantageous in this respect is that when it decides to do something differently, it really sets about doing it differently. And we have found in the last couple of years that China has made a lot of progress, for instance, on banning ivory markets. It's had a near total ban on ivory markets in China that has helped drive down the price. I mentioned the task forces that I chair earlier, and included in those task forces now are companies like China's Southern Airlines and the China Forestry Agency. The government agency in charge of wildlife has signed up to our Buckingham Palace operation, of the standards we want to meet. So when the system swings around and is persuaded of something, it does act. From what I understand, in the last couple of months, they're very busy in China, closing down where they can, they're closing down wherever they can, the trade in wildlife, that aspect of the so-called wet markets, and subsidizing those who've been farming wildlife animals to turn away from that to more conventional farming. We'll see how committed they are to this, how much they follow through on this. But China is capable of taking determined action and can be persuaded to do so in its own interests and through diplomacy. More broadly, well, countries do have big incentives to take action if they think about it. Their tourist industries, their private sector is often very willing to get involved. Kenya Airways was a founding member of our task force. Some of them have very determined leaders who want to tackle this subject. And Shamini just made a lot of very important points about how aid can be used effectively, where a pound or dollar of aid can be most effectively spent, often in the criminal justice area. And I think a strategy for Western countries about how to tackle this should definitely include realigning aid budgets with that objective.
Fascinating. Yeah, agreed. And I think that's something that has happened in the past. I think we've had a UK international criminal justice system that invested capacity and embedded it and partnered with national jurisdictions to achieve outcomes along the criminal trial process. So I think, what a great idea. That's a great opportunity. John, I mean, one thing I'd say is I was fascinated today, actually. It's quite fortuitous, but I did see that China has placed pangolins onto a higher level of protection, and it's taken them off the species that could be traded for medicine. So, I think just building on that point, William, it seems that, there is opportunity, there is scope to get China around the table and put some muscle into this. But John, you've been in this space for a long time, and going back to the ground level, what investments on the ground are needed now to ensure wild animals don't get harvested illegally and enter the supply chain?
Thanks, Max. And it's been a great discussion. And I think Shamini gave us some very good insights into the real challenges associated with prosecuting these offences on the ground. What are the real day-to-day challenges you confront in trying to deal with people that are illegally trading in wildlife? And what I'd like to focus on here is, I believe we need to put much more effort on protecting wildlife at source before it ever enters illegal trade. Because once it's in illegal trade, that animal or plant is either dead or it's never going to find its way back to the wild. It's lost. And we're there chasing a prosecution or chasing after the people that are associated with it to try and prosecute them and convict them and have them punished. Let's put far more effort into protecting wildlife at source. Because, if we can protect wildlife at source, there are so many other benefits. There are climate benefits. There are development benefits. There are security benefits. What I would like to see, and this is something I've learned a lot from African parks, the work with African parks, from visiting the Northern Rangelands Trust in Kenya, the work in Gorongosa in Mozambique, the work that WCS and Frankfurt Zoological Society all do. If we can focus long-term commitments to biodiverse rich places that are captured in protected areas or other area-based initiatives, community-based initiatives, if we focus not for 1 or 2 years, 20 to 50 years on these biodiverse rich places and the communities living within and around them and invest in them, we are going to find that we are generating multiple benefits. Firstly, we're going to find that the area becomes secure. We end the poaching, we protect the biodiversity, we create the enabling conditions that allow us to secure the carbon and sell that carbon on the voluntary carbon market. We generate decent jobs. You've seen this through Space for Giants. the jobs you can generate through tourism and in other ways. We can generate local enterprise, and those local people will be the best protectors of that wildlife. And this is not a theory. We have seen this across the 17 protected areas that are managed by African parks in 11 countries. Poaching goes down severely, employment goes up, the community engagement goes up. I think we have a magnificent opportunity here if we can tap into the right resources. And the benefits of protecting biodiversity at source go well beyond conservation. It's about climate change. It's about security. It's about development. It's about public health, because you're not allowing people to take this wildlife in the first place. We cannot keep relying on conservation budgets. We should look at health budgets, security budgets, foreign assistance budgets. They all need to converge and start investing in these biodiverse rich places. Then we'll find the poaching and the smuggling doesn't take place in the first place, takes pressure off prosecutors and the judicial system. We're generating jobs, we're delivering on the sustainable development goals, so many benefits. So what I would like to see is a huge focus on protecting wildlife at source through investing in biodiverse rich places and their local communities, getting multiple benefits. The UK is starting to do this through the Biodiverse Landscape Fund. Germany is looking at it through the Legacy Landscapes Fund. Let's stop wildlife ever getting into illegal trade in the first place.
John, I think your call to action there is spot on, and it's presumably now more apparent than ever that this wildlife trade is something that we should all be concerned about. It's no longer a concern among a fringe of society, but it's become very clear that this is potentially something that can bring the world as we know it to a halt, as indeed it has done. So I think, in terms of marshalling interest and resources towards, having a much more focused effort into protecting wildlife at source, I would have thought that's an opportunity and a silver lining in the current crisis. Shamini, wearing your prosecution hat, what do you think, and we've talked about this already, but building on some of our previous discussions today, what do you think is needed at a practical level to create a real deterrent to stop the illegal wildlife trade?
Well, I think, as I've already alluded to, I think the public, wherever they are, must have confidence that if a crime is committed, it will be investigated properly, charged correctly, tried swiftly, and sentenced in a predictable and proportionate way. And at the moment, determined criminals know that they have so little to fear from the criminal justice systems in which they work. And the large-scale seizures that we've seen over the last few years really only represent a disruption to their operations and not an end. Now, the solution lies, in my view, in 4 particular areas, and I've already touched on 2 of them. Number 1 is supporting prosecution institutions and the way in which they charge their criminal cases. And the UK and NGOs have been able to do this, where they've taken a holistic approach to impact all crime. And we need to speed up criminal trials by enabling judiciaries to pass procedural rules, and that usually only takes a practice direction from a Chief Justice. If it needs to be embedded in law, that can be done by a very small amendment to criminal procedure rules, which can be passed in the annual statutory miscellaneous amendments act that most countries pass once a year. And as I mentioned earlier to William, the British government did that in Kenya, and the lessons learned from that experience could speed up the delivery of those interventions in other jurisdictions. We also need to actually lobby and support the provision of legal aid. And I know that sounds counterintuitive to a lot of your viewers. That's not because I think wildlife traffickers should have the Defence Council paid for by the government, because believe me, they're very happy to pay for their own excellent representation. But because over 80% of the defendants in criminal cases across Africa have no representation. And in my experience in the Crown Courts of London, facing an unrepresented defendant, I just know that that case is going to go extra slow. I can't have a discussion with an unrepresented defendant about admissibility of evidence or making admissions or plea bargaining or any of that. So unrepresented defendants slow things down, and then that impacts the rest of the criminal justice chain. And finally, when it comes to sentencing, the fourth area I'd focus on would be delivering binding and prescriptive sentencing guidelines, a bit like what we have here in the UK under the Sentencing Council. Those could be piloted in the context of wildlife crime to demonstrate the way in which they work. I think the lobbying for high minimum terms of imprisonment by so many conservation NGOs betrays their lack of understanding of the trial process. High minimum terms means no plea bargaining, no early guilty plea, no cooperation. It just means more trials. And it also means injustice, as we see in Zimbabwe, where a young man was sent to prison for 9 years for possession of a single python skin in a country where there is no welfare system to look after his family. I mean, even the Trump administration has accepted that mandatory minimum terms are a blunt and unjust instrument. So those solutions that I'm proposing require a deep understanding, I mean, even an empathy with how prosecutors and judges work, the challenges that they face, and the factors that make it easy to corrupt them. And all of the proposal that I've suggested do mitigate the risks of corruption in this sector. There's no doubt in my mind, and both William and John have touched on it, we need a transformation in the way that we approach illegal wildlife crime. That involves utilising the expertise that exists but currently isn't fully utilised. And I think we need to stop siloing ourselves into the themes of money laundering, wildlife crime, human trafficking, and understand that by separating our responses into those themes, it cannot change the fact that when a prosecutor walks into court and finds himself facing 24 trials with everything from shoplifting to heroin trafficking to child abuse, which is what I observed, that ivory case is going to go to the back of the queue. So as William has said, the world right now has never been more alive to the risk of zoonotic disease transmission and the role that the illegal wildlife trade might play. And so I would absolutely endorse that this is the time to galvanize political will. But I would say it's not, let's just get tough on wildlife crime, but rather let's see our criminal justice systems, support those criminal justice systems, finally function in a way that will create security and justice for all. And I'm excited by William's proposal that the world of aid should re-strategize and realign their focus towards criminal justice systems in a holistic way. I don't think another opportunity like this is going to come along in a long, long time.
Thank you, Shamini. Really interesting and really useful. Well, we've used up my questions, but there are lots of questions that come in from our audience. And I see that, that no one's dropped off and numbers have been steadily going up. Hundreds of people have tuned in. One for you, William. For the general public who are really concerned about this crucial issue, preventing the next pandemic, what can they do?
Well, they live in a democratic country, and they can make their views very clear in all sorts of ways, and everybody can take part in the debate about this. You know, I mentioned that even in China, there are tens of millions of people. I've forgotten the number, and there maybe isn't a single number that represents it, saying on social media, even in that authoritarian society, we've had enough of these wildlife markets and we don't want this to happen again. And, you know, we shouldn't be eating these things and things of that kind. So if public opinion can make itself felt to some extent in China, well, it certainly can make itself felt in Britain, France, America, and across much of Africa. So everybody can take part in that way. And many people will work in companies where this is an issue. You know, I mentioned at the beginning that we've now trained over 70,000 staff in transportation companies to be aware of the illegal wildlife trade. But we need a lot more of that awareness, and we need the cooperation of ports and airports and companies throughout the world. So there are many individuals who, through their positions in the private sector, can contribute directly to this work.
Yeah, well, agreed, and that's helpful. And I think lots of people from the general public are going to be asking this question increasingly, you know, as the immediate crisis gets behind us in terms of public health, and I think they're going to be focused on that. So that's a useful starting point. John, there's a question here from Ethel Makila. From your perspective, what would be the priority actions towards having illegal wildlife trade recognized as a global public health security issue? You know, for CITES, for example.
Yeah, I think that the status quo cannot be an option. And I think the beauty of this debate that you've had today, Max, is that we're all agreed that the status quo is not an option. Whether you're looking at the country level and the way in which criminal justice systems are working, right up to the international system and the way in which the international legal framework is in place. Just focusing at that side, we cannot regulate wildlife trade the way we are, which is only looking at trade and biological criteria and dismissing from that trade transaction consideration of public health and animal health. As I said, we need a one health. That needs to converge. There are many options for doing that, but I think we have to institutionalize this, because if we look at the environment after SARS, a lot of actions were taken, but our memories are short, and those actions started to fade away over time. We need to institutionalize change. We cannot just be content with things happening here and there now that are very positive. We need to institutionalize it within the international legal framework so that it's still there in 10, 20, 30 years, and we can monitor progress. So we must, as a philosophical point of view, embed public health and animal health into wildlife trade. My preferred option is amending CITES, and there's a way, a means of doing that, but it's not the only option. On the illegal trade side, I think we have to go both ends. The international framework should be corrected. We need to send a very clear message that wildlife crime is considered serious crime and broaden the scope beyond illegal wildlife trade. At the same time, do exactly what Shamini's been saying, is that you can't say that's enough, because you've got criminal justice systems that are not working effectively and need resourcing. So we need to go both ends. So I'd like to see that. But, you know, as hard as we go against the criminals on one end, and we really need to go hard against them, we need to go equally hard at source and work with local communities and support local communities to make sure that the wildlife that they should benefit from is not being stolen from them with organised crime benefiting. The locals should benefit from that. So, you know, I think this all has to go in parallel. And I don't think it's one or other. We have to do it collectively. And this package of measures, if we move forward, will put us in the best place to avert the next pandemic. But we certainly can't just be content with the status quo. We're going to be in the same spot in the not too distant future.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, agreed. There's one here for you, Shamini, I believe, which is, you know, there are a number of groups doing great work in countering illegal trafficking in their respective areas. However, their efforts are often inhibited by a lack of sharing of information and intelligence. There is a global system across all these disciplines which allow pre-qualified stakeholders and authorities to contribute and share knowledge and information. The joint power could really magnify wonderfully. Is anyone working on such a system? And if not, how do we get such a system going?
I think there are a number of networks already established, at least that I know of, across Africa and in the Far East for intelligence sharing. And I think the task force that William has talked about has also set up those sorts of networks. So intelligence is actually being shared. The problem is again, comes down to what can they do with that intelligence? Can they actually disrupt a seizure, for example, disrupt a criminal offence? They may lead to a seizure of a large container, as we see that huge haul of swim bladders just yesterday. But are they following it back to the source? Can they trace where it came from? And this is where that Know Your Customer initiative that we're working on in Kenya, which has the support of the Cabinet Secretary there, is going to be quite important, because it will enable an investigator to then follow that. We mustn't forget that it is an investigator. He is the one that drives a case from the floor of a national park to the doors of a courtroom. And so far, I think there is a lack of real thorough training of investigators across the board. And most importantly, we do the training, where we do the training, we're not institutionalizing that change. It doesn't become part of their core competencies or their roles and responsibilities as investigators within the institutions. There is no obligation on investigators or crime scene responders after they attend this training to actually put it into practice. So the networks are there, but we want to see results. We have to rethink the way that we are spending our money in terms of the interventions on investigations, prosecutions, and judicial training.
Yeah, exactly, Shamini. I think that's a really useful point. There's a question here, and I just want to pivot slightly because obviously everything we've been talking about is very much around the supply, and that's what the main subject of this conversation. But William, you alluded at the very beginning of this discussion to this real need to make it undesirable to consume wildlife products. I'm just curious to know, how impactful has it been to get major public figures in Asia and in other wildlife consumption markets to just say, look, this is not cool. I mean, are we aware of their impact and how powerful that has been?
Yes, that can make an impact, and leadership in a country can make a huge difference. I think in the 1980s in Japan turned right around on ivory, from the emperor downwards, that this is just not a thing you should be buying anymore. And so leadership and role models making this clear, I think does make a big difference. So we probably need to have more of that, and we can have more of that. We ought to be able to have more of that on the back of this pandemic. It's important to stress as well that although this is a complex international trade, there are some real hotspots in where the demand arises. Of course, in parts of China, in Southeast Asia. And so this is not just a question of China. There are other countries involved. And there are some people all over the world who get involved in an illegal wildlife trade, but there are certain hotspots in the world. And so it's important to zero in on those places, to make sure that in Vietnam, in Laos, in Indonesia, that as well as in China, people are receiving this message.
Thank you, William. Yeah, well, I think that's a really good point, and I think it's something else we will be discussing as part of this Giants conversation series in partnership with the Arts Club. I think we have just about run out of time for all the questions from the audience. I want to say a huge thank you to our panelists, William, John, Shamini, really fascinating insights into what you all feel can work to get on top of preventing the next pandemic. I think I want to thank the audience for tuning in and joining our debate. I think everyone should pay close attention to these milestones that are coming up, and whatever you can do out there in your own capacity to lobby for change. We've got G20 coming up this year, as William and John alluded to. We've got the COP for climate change, which we hosted in the United Kingdom. And of course, we've got the Convention on Biodiversity, which is going to be hosted in China. So some real opportunities to achieve concerted action at those moments. And I really hope we see not just the government, the UK government, but governments around the world marshalling their resources to ensure, as Shamini pointed out, it's not just the conventions at the top level, but also there's investment in the criminal trial process and the jurisdictions which hold wildlife and trade in it. So everyone, very exciting, really enjoyed that discussion. Again, thank you so much. Thanks for tuning in. I'm going to hand over to Susan now, Warren from the Arts Club. And that's all from me. Thank you very much. Susanna, over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Max, Lord Hague, John and Shamini for your tremendous insights today. It really was such an important discussion. And as Shamini says, a great opportunity at the moment to make some meaningful changes. The Arts Club's so proud to partner with Space for Giants. It's remarkable really to see the wildlife conservation work that they do, how they engage governments, work to change legislation, engage key experts in the conservation space, and how they educate and work with communities on the ground and curate brilliant speakers for these events, so that we can all learn more about topics like this. in the wildlife conservation space and what we can do to play our part in making a difference. For those of you who missed the first of our giant conversations a couple of weeks ago, you can find the podcast and video link in the chat at the bottom of your screen. It was a really powerful talk discussing the illegal killing and consumption of wildlife and what it means for the human food chain and its connection to human pandemics like COVID-19. We had Max Gamera, who's Director of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services at the UN. Dr. Gladys Kalema, who's a Ugandan wildlife veterinarian, conservationist, and epidemiologist. And Professor Lee White, who is the Minister for Forests, Oceans, Environment and Climate Change in Gabon. We've also put a link to sign up to the Space for Giants newsletters so you can keep up to date with our next giant conversations, which will be announced soon. So thank you everyone for joining. Do stay healthy, stay well, and I will leave you now with a 2-minute video outlining some of the work that Space for Giants does. Good night.
This is the front line of the battle to protect elephants. Mobile units of rangers like this one in Laikipia patrol Africa's wildernesses daily in an attempt to stop poachers from killing elephants for their tusks. Since 2007, more than a third of African elephants have been lost, most of them from poaching. That's an average of one elephant every half hour, day in, day out, year after year.
There are so many challenges involved and risks from wildlife. We have had one of our team commanders who was shot on the thigh by some bad guys who were pursuing. So that is how dangerous it can be.
For Space for Giants, it's much more than just boots on the ground. It's making frontline protection smarter.
They cover several aspects. Other than just the physical, tactical skills, they're also, taught on some bits of intelligence gathering and how to work with communities to get information, to be our ear on the ground.
Through its projects in Kenya, Space for Giants has helped to drive a 94% reduction in poaching in 4 years. What's been underestimated and perhaps overlooked in the past is the importance of making the prosecution process watertight. Across Africa, Space for Giants is training investigators, prosecutors and magistrates so cases against poachers are as strong as they can be. Space for Giants' Faith Mena is currently monitoring more than 40 wildlife crime cases. Monitoring the trials helps to make sure they proceed smoothly.
Just like it matters with the rangers in the field protecting those animals, it also matters here because when it comes to court, we are able to reach not just the accused person, but members of the public. When that case results in a conviction, it sends the message out there: poaching does not pay.
The threat from poaching is still a very real one and must be eliminated if elephants are to have any chance of surviving. Hopefully, with improved anti-poaching patrols and stricter prosecutions, we can beat the poaching crisis. But if there isn't any elephant habitat left by then, all those efforts will have been in vain.